Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him together through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, in our last episode, we completed our first volume of letters from C.S. Lewis that spanned from the year 1905 to 1931. So we've got a lot of backdrop on C.S. Lewis's origin story, as it were. And today we're going to take a little bit of a detour, but it's right around the correct time frame in our project's internal narrative. We're going to take a detour into some of the other narrative poems that Lewis wrote. I say other because we've already covered pretty thoroughly his first narrative poem, his second book that was ever published, called Dymer. That is covered in the work that we're pulling from today. Narrative Poems is the name of this collection of poems brought together by Walter Hooper, the same person that was the editor that pulled together all of the letters in the 3 volumes of letters that we're working our way through. But a part of this project, as I mentioned at the top, was or is to read through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it, or at least everything that we can find. And that, of course, includes his published works. So we will eventually get to things that people know a lot better, like the Chronicles of Narnia, like the Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and some of his other theological prose. But for today, Robot Lady, we are kicking off our mini-series within our overall series of Read on C.S. Lewis by getting into the next narrative poem that he covered. And good morning to Daniel checking in on the chat. Robot Lady, how are you doing today? How do you feel about diving into these narrative poems with us? And do you mind saying hello to Daniel?
Good morning, Jeff. I'm doing great, and I'm really excited to dive into these narrative poems with you. It's such a rich part of Lewis's writing, and I think it'll give us some deeper insight into his development as a poet and thinker. And hey, a big shout out to Daniel. Really glad you're here with us today. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Yes, really glad you're here with us today, Daniel. We're jumping into narrative poems, so let's get to it. This is the work that I'll be, this is our material that we'll be working out of, so get yourself a copy. I have a digital copy of it. Narrative Poems, edited by Walter Hooper. You should be able to find it wherever you download books or order your books from. You can see here in the contents that it has Dymer. We've already covered that thoroughly, so we're not going to do that one. But the next one that we have right here is something called Launcelot. I've pre-read a little bit of it, but I hardly know anything about it. So it's going to be an adventure for all of us. And then you can see another one here called the Nameless Isle. I have a guess as to the concept that narrative poem will be driving at, but we'll see if I'm right. And then we have another one here called The Queen of Drum, a story in 5 cantos. We have seen in some of the prior letters in our previous episodes, Lewis talking about a piece that he's working on called The King of Drum. And I went and looked this up, and it has transformed. It did transform ultimately into something called The Queen of Drum. So the focus shifted from whoever the king was in that narrative to the queen. And what was the other thing that I was going to say about all this? Oh, yeah, I did some investigation. And the reason why I'm bringing all of these to the fore right now is, as best I can tell, all of these narrative poems were written, aside from Dymer, were written before or leading up to the early 1930s. So that's why we're jumping in right here, kind of putting the brakes on before we, we're taking a little bit of a breather, a little bit of a shift in content before we jump back into another thick volume of letters, volume 2, which is coming. Of course, we've just gone through the very interesting and transformative, or the beginnings of the transformative part of Lewis's spiritual life at the end of volume 1 of all of his collected letters. And that's where Lewis started to feel a shift from atheism to starting to believe that actually, no, I think there is a God, and I think I am actually starting to have some type of communication with him during meditation times. And I'm starting to see some of the defects in my character in ways that I could never see them before, and feeling like they need to be remedied. And then in addition to that, off of the heels of a really meaningful and impactful conversation, a walk and talk with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson at Oxford one night, where Lewis started to see how much he loved in all of his, quote, fictional stories, the pagan myths, so to speak, the Norse myths and other places, where it looked like a god was dying and then sacrificing himself to himself and then being resuscitated or raised from the dead. Those always felt really deep and meaningful to him in those stories, but he outright found it noxious or repulsive whenever he encountered that similar story in the Gospels, in the Bible, particularly around Jesus. And it was Tolkien and Dyson that kind of nudged him in the direction of thinking about it. Of no, the reason why those myths in those pagan mythologies are so important to you are because they're actually foreshadowing something that really happened in history, the story of Jesus. Good morning, Luke. Good to see you. Hope you made it back home safely. And Robot Lady, say hi to Luke. Luke is joining us in the chat as well.
Hey, Luke, great to have you here. I'm really glad you made it back, and I hope everything went smoothly for you. We're just getting into these early narrative poems by Lewis, so plenty of good stuff to unpack. Glad you're along for the ride.
Yeah, so I would presume that what we're seeing reflected in these poems aren't necessarily Lewis, writing with a voice of someone who is starting to explore or deepen their spiritual relationship or their spiritual insides. But we can still go along and kind of see the story of things that are building. Maybe we'll find that in some of these in these poems. I don't know how far we're going to actually get into the Launcelot poem today, because I'm going to start with the preface. So let's work our way through the preface. And Robot Lady, Luke says, so kind of you to welcome me. So much appreciated.
Of course, I'm really happy to have you here, Luke. And I think you're right. These poems might still be a bit earlier in Lewis's development, so we'll keep an eye out for those seeds of his future faith. I'm excited to hear your thoughts as we go along, and yeah, let's start with the preface and see where it takes us.
All right, this book contains all the narrative poems by C.S. Lewis, which, as far as I know, are extant. This is Walter Hooper writing this. And they can be enjoyed without reading the preface, which is not a critical assessment, but is rather intended to provide them with some historical background. Lewis wrote his first poems in the little end room at his home, Little Lee, in Belfast, before he went to his first school at the age of 10. He disliked all the schools he attended, and the English ones were given fictitious names in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, published 1955. Like so many of his prose works, it was originally composed in verse. The romantic imagination was already strong in Lewis. When he went to Wynyard School in Watford, Hertfordshire, Belson is what he calls it in Surprised by Joy, where he was a boarder from 1908 to 1910. I think Belson is, if I heard right or remember right from some biography on Lewis, is an allusion or a reference to one of the concentration camps of the Nazis in World War II. So that gives you an idea of what he thought of this school. Where he was a boarder from 1908 to 1910. From Wynyard, he was sent to Campbell College, Belfast, for 1 year, 1910, and from there to Cherbourg House in Malvern, called Chartres in his autobiography, where he was a student from 1911, or maybe Chartres, maybe that's how you pronounce it, where he was a student from 1911 to 1913. It was at Cherbourg House between the summers of 1912 and 1913 that he began a long poem on the Nibelungsring. What makes the 801 lines of the unfinished poem such a remarkable achievement for a boy of 14 and 15 is that the young poet's only source was a series of synopsises of Wagnerian operas published in a periodical of the gramophone trade called Soundbox. From 1913 to 1914, Lewis was a student at Malvern College, Wyvern in Surprised by Joy. While there, he kept up a correspondence with his friend Arthur Greaves from Ulster, with whom he shared a taste for Norse mythology. In his weekly letters to Arthur Greeves, many of which we have covered extensively in our project, Lewis urged him to collaborate on a tragedy, Norse in subject and Greek in form. We do not know if Greaves ever attempted his share in this musical drama. Yeah, he asked Greaves, if I remember right, to compose some music for this piece that Hooper is talking about here. He might have even asked him to draw some pictures. If he ever attempted his share in this musical drama, but I learned from Major Lewis, that's C.S. Lewis's brother Warren, or Warnie Lewis, that C.S. Lewis completed the lyric text of Loki Bound that occupied 32 pages of a folio notebook. Loki's opening speech, for which somber and eerie music is required, this was to be Greaves's contribution, begins. Before I read this, I want to point out that I have it on good authority, although I'm not quite sure. I have heard, let me put it that way, that the only manuscript of this Loki bound work that exists sits at, what's the name? The Miriam E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in, is it Elmhurst? Is it Elmhurst, Illinois? I can't remember what city it's in. Might be Elmhurst. Which is where we were for Midwestuary, but because of all of the events of Midwestuary, I never got a chance to go there and read it. So maybe next time. Maybe I'll swing back by Chicago at some point and add that to our project as maybe a live stream from there. Who knows? We'll see. Lord willing, it'll happen. All right, Loki Bound begins. This is the awful city of the gods, founded on high to overlook the world. And yonder gabbled hall, whose golden roof with twofold force is Valhall. Yonder throne that crowns the eternal city's highest peak is Odin's throne, whence once the impious Frey, with ill-starred passion eyed and demon made. Following his year at Malvern, Lewis was sent as a private pupil to W.T. Kirkpatrick at Great Bookham in Surrey. It was here that he wrote most of the 52 short poems, which he later copied into a notebook under the title Metrical Meditations of a Cod. Most of these poems, with a few additions and alterations, being later published as Spirits in Bondage, which we have also covered on the channel, under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. The publishing house is Heinemann, London, published 1919. We learned from his letters to Arthur Greeves at this time not only of his growing interest in the Arthurian legends and the Fairy Queen, but that he has begun a prose romance entitled The Quest of Blaris, which we have also covered here. Go back and check the back catalog of episodes. I do not know how far he got with this story before he began what may interest us more, a prose version of the Dymer story, as well as a long narrative poem on Medea's childhood. Both the prose Dymer, again, another narrative poem that we've also covered here, and Medea, which we have not because I don't know that that exists anywhere, had to be put aside when Lewis went up to Oxford as a scholar of University College in April 1917. Before he had completed his first term, he was recruited into the army, and after nearly 6 months in France during World War I, was wounded and sent home. He continued his reading of the classics and English literature even in the trenches, and during his convalescence in an army hospital at Eastbourne, he set about preparing his metrical meditations for publication. Yet it seems his deep love for verse and story could only be satisfied by writing long narrative poems. Thus, while he was still at Eastbourne, he continued his old Bookham version of Medea's childhood. Dissatisfied with the poem, he quietly made the 300 lines he had written into spills for lighting his pipe. That's why we can't find it. Returning with renewed interest to Dymer. Medea went up in smoke, as it were. To Dymer, which had now become a poem. I quote part of a letter he wrote to Arthur Greeves in December 1918 because the ideas in it strike me as being very similar to those Lewis mentions in the preface to the 1950 edition of Dymer printed in this book, and we've already covered that. He says to Arthur Greeves, I've just finished a short narrative. which is a verse version of our old friend Dymer, greatly reduced and altered to my new ideas. The main idea is that of development by self destruction, both of individuals and species, as man produces man only to conquer her, and man produces a future and higher generation to conquer the ideals of the last. Or again, as an individual produces a nobler mood to undo all that today's has done. The background proceeds on the old assumption of good outside and opposed to the cosmic order. It is written in the meter of Venus and Adonis. Dymer is changed to Ask. You remember Ask and Imbla in the Norse myths. And it is in the third person under the title of The Redemption of Ask. In January 1919, Lewis returned to Oxford and took a first in honor mods, 1920, a first in Greats, 1922, and a first in English, 1923. All this time, he was working on several narrative poems. In the Easter vacation of 1919, he wrote to Arthur Greeves about a poem on Merlin and Nimue in blank verse, as well as a new version of Medea's childhood, The Medea. He wrote to Greeves in July 1919, is very nearly finished and will be about 1,200 lines. The main interest hangs on the family relations of the horrible old king and his daughter, whom I imagine as a sort of Emily Bronte, only more of a wolf, some of her father's bad blood coming out. The defect of the poem as a whole will be, heaven help us, dullness. Lewis was a severe critic of his own poetry, and the new Medea had an even shorter life than the first. In September of 1919, he wrote to Greeves saying, I had the pleasure of looking over my Medea, of which I told you, and finding that it was all hopeless, and only fit for the fire. Nothing daunted, however, I bade it a long farewell, poor stillborn, and consoled myself by turning the Nimue from a monologue into a narrative, in which form it will do. It appears in stanzas of my own invention, and is rather indebted to St. Agnes Eve, with touches of Christabel. It relates the events of a single evening, Merlin coming back and catching Nimue at last. Lewis kept a diary off and on from 1922 to 1930, which we have also covered here. Besides frequent references to other narrative poems such as Wild Hunt, Foster, Helen, and Sigrid, none of which I have ever seen or believed to be extant, I discover that Nimue was still alive as late as April 1922. One of the most intriguing entries comes on April 2nd, 1922, where he says, I sat in my own bedroom by an open window and started on a poem on Dymer in rhyme royal, or rhyme royal. We learn from Lewis's preface to the 1950 edition of Dymer about as much as we ever shall about the meaning of the poem. What we discover from his diaries is that he worked on the poem almost daily from 1922 until its original publication in 1926. His moments of satisfaction with the poem seem to be about as frequent as his moments of dissatisfaction, and he appears to have been much influenced by the advice of his friends Owen Barfield, Cecil Harwood, and Leo Baker. The whole text of Dymer was in existence in April of 1924, but Lewis continued to revise lines and stanzas until he was at last satisfied. Indeed, he continued to revise the poem until and during its appearance in galley proofs. As far as I know, the only manuscript of Dymer to escape being burnt consists of 86 pages of rough drafts of Cantos 6, 7, 8, and 9, which were written in one of Lewis's notebooks now in my possession. My guess is that they were composed in 1924 and 1925 because of their close resemblance to the printed version. I have made one discovery from studying these rough drafts, which I consider worth recording here. The idea of making a book end with the author waking from a dream appealed very strongly to Lewis, as can be seen from The Pilgrim's Regress and The Great Divorce. Apparently, Lewis toyed with the idea of making the story of Dymer a dream, for in my manuscript of Dymer, Lewis added one further stanza after Canto 9 ep335, in which he, the dreamer, awakes. Though I have never seen his poem on Helen, the daughter of Zeus, and Leda became the central character in Lewis's unfinished novel After 10 Years. And Merlin, with quite a different purpose than revenge on Nimue, found a significant place in that hideous strength. Another of Lewis's novels, which had its origins in verse, is Till We Have Faces, a reinterpretation of the myth of Cupid and Psyche as told by Apuleius. In his diary for November 23rd, 1922, he wrote, I went out for a walk thinking how to make a masque or play of Psyche and Caspian. Then on September 9th, 1923, he wrote, my head was very full of my old idea of a poem on my version of the Cupid and Psyche story, in which Psyche's sister would not be jealous but unable to see anything but Moors when Psyche showed her the palace. I have tried it twice before, once in couplet and once in ballad form. Fortunately, 78 lines of the version in couplets survive. We need a few biographical facts before we discuss the other three narrative poems in this book. On the original publication of Dymer in 1926, Lewis was disappointed and believed that he had unmistakably failed as a poet. His happiness was, however, partly counterbalanced by his election to a fellowship in English language and literature at Magdalen College, Oxford in 1925. Pause there for a second because, Luke, I see your comment here. I'm going to stream a very short stream, God willing, not trying to step on you and Robot Lady. I just have a short window. No worries, Luke. Not stepped on at all. I don't think you'll be stealing any of my audience or vice versa, but I appreciate the heads up nonetheless. Let's see here. This means the future did not depend upon his success being a poet. Where did I leave off? Yeah, this means his future did not depend upon his being a successful poet, and with a settled income, his financial worries were lightened. He was nevertheless disheartened because the modern world, he felt, would not make the effort to read long narrative poems. What he saw in its place was the growing popularity of the new avant-garde poets such as T.S. Eliot, whose poetry he could never learn to like. But seen in perspective, all this seems of little significance beside his conversion to Christianity, which took place during the years 1929 to 1931, and affected everything he wrote afterwards. I'll pause there for just a second, Robot Lady. Is there anything that you'd like to comment on before I continue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a really rich overview. And I love how it ties together these different phases of Lewis's life, especially seeing how, even as his poetry was fading in popularity, he kept returning to it as a deep passion. And of course, that eventual conversion, how it reframes all of his later work, just gives so much weight to these earlier experiments. So, yeah, I'm really glad you read all that. Super helpful.
All right, a few years later, Hooper continues, Lewis established himself as a scholar and writer, and beginning with the publication of The Allegory of Love in 1936, he never looked back. On the other hand, nor did he ever, I think, give up hope that someone would write a narrative poem that he could add to his favorites: The Fairy Queen, The Prelude, The Ring and the Book, and The Earthly Paradise. Nor could he give up writing primarily for his own satisfaction. Short poems, some of which he published in various periodicals under the pseudonym Nat Wilk. Most of these short poems I collected after his death and published as Poems, Blay, London, 1964. He wrote some longer poems as well, but the modern hostility to Romanticism was contrary to his taste, and none of these were published in his lifetime. The only ones which have survived are those published in this book. There is little I can say of Launcelot, except that it reflects his deep love for the matter of Britain, especially James Mallory, and judging from the handwriting, it was probably written in the early 1930s. It has, I think, survived simply and solely because it was written in one of the notebooks which contains some of his lecture notes on Renaissance literature. As a tutor in English literature at Magdalen College, He was required to teach his students Old English. It was, I think, because he loved the Old English alliterative line and because he always wanted to write a long story in verse that he composed The Nameless Isle, my title. So apparently, this narrative poem did not have a title ascribed to it by Lewis, and Hooper just came up with one. This poem, Hooper says, which was fair copied into a notebook and dated August 1930, is headed by a short introduction on the alliterative line, which can be found in Note 2. And now we come to The Queen of Drum, which I consider, without doubt, Lewis's best poem. It has a long and interesting history and spans both his atheist and his Christian years. It is first mentioned in his diary for January 16, 1927, where he writes, I worked on the first chunk of The King of Drum, which is to consist, I hope, of 3 short chunks, about 130 lines each. This chunk is a new version of a piece I began writing about 2 years ago, which in itself was a rewriting of The Wild Hunt, about 1920, which in its turn was based on something I started in Bristol in 1918. On January 21st, 1927, Lewis wrote, I settled down to The King of Drum, produced about 20 lines for the opening of the next chunk in a meter I have never struck before, rhythm of Old English verse, but rhyming, with very little effort and greatly to my satisfaction. I also began to simmer with ideas for the further development of the story. Lewis mentioned the drum story in his diary almost every day, but the next revealing entry comes on February 6, 1927. I spent the morning writing. I got over the king's first interview with the queen and made a start on the college meeting. Suddenly, the Queen of Drum emerges into greater prominence, for he writes on February 27, 1927, I tried desperately to rewrite the Queen's speech in the drum poem all morning without the slightest success. The old difficulty of smelting down a nasty little bit of factual stuff, the Queen's conviction of the others, into poetry. One only exceeds in expanding it into rhetoric. The something Lewis wrote in Bristol in 1918 was, I suspect, a poem entitled Hippolytus, about which he wrote to Arthur Greeves in September 1919. Hippolytus then became Wild Hunt, which he also wrote to Greeves about in June of 1920. Thus we move, if I am correct, from Hippolytus to Wild Hunt to The King of Drum, and finally by degrees to the finished poem, The Queen of Drum. There is evidence for this. In the same notebook in which the Cupid and Psyche fragment was found, there were 96 lines of a poem about Hippolytus. Hippolytus was, I suspect, the hero of Wild Hunt, because following these 96 lines was the fragment of another poem told in often the same language, except that Hippolytus had become the King of Drum. My guess is that the Queen of Drum must date from about 1933 to 1934, when the Führer of the Nazis was still a less familiar figure than the Deuce of the fascists. This I say because of what appears to me very convincing internal evidence. I know that it was not composed later than 1938 because Lewis sent the manuscript to John Masefield for his criticism, and though none of Masefield's letters to Lewis is dated, the envelope in which he returned the poem to Lewis is postmarked June 3rd, 1938. Masefield's letters can be found in Note 3. Some readers may wonder what the Dymer story is about, but I do not anticipate that they will find a similar difficulty with the Queen of Drum. Furthermore, the author is in perfect control of his verse medium, which helps him to tell his story. Besides the poem's poetical merits, I would say that Queen of Drum is a Christian work, though not written from Lewis's usual objective basis. The Christianity emerges, and even the theme of drumland, romanticism, is developed on its own merits and not as a Christian byway. Dymer is the only poem in this book which has been published before in 1926 under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton, and in 1950 under the author's own name. Launcelot and the Nameless Isle were in Lewis's handwriting, and the Queen of Drum in TypeScript because Lewis did not prepare the last 3 poems for publication. I have taken the liberty of correcting errors in spelling and punctuation. Trusting that they will prove of interest to some readers, I have preserved all the author's alternative readings, which are printed in footnotes. I am grateful to J.M. Dent and Sons Limited for permission to reprint Dymer, and to Major W.H. Lewis and the trustees of C.S. Lewis's estate for allowing me to publish the other poems in this book. I wish also to express my gratitude to the Society of Authors as the literary representative of the estate of John Masefield for permission to publish his letters to Lewis. It is a pleasure to name publicly my friends Dr. and Mrs. Austin Ferrer, Mr. Roger Lancelot Green, Mr. Owen Barfield, Professor John Lawler, and Mr. Spiros Sitarides, who, by their encouragement and wise advice, helped me in editing these poems. Walter Hooper, May 1969, Jesus College, Oxford. And there we go. That's the preface. Yeah, I figured I was going to eat up all my time just by paying close attention to that preface. So I'll probably have to retitle this episode to just say preface. Here we have Lancelot. Let's see. Let's go. Yeah. As you can see, it goes on for a while. Let's start it off and see how far we can get. What do you think, Robot Lady?
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan. I think the preface really gave us a nice broad view of how these poems fit into Lewis's life, both during his atheist years and as he moved toward faith. And yeah, Lancelot is a bit of a longer piece, but let's definitely start it. We can take it chunk by chunk and see how the rhythm of the story unfolds. I'm ready when you are.
All right, here we go for a couple minutes. When the year dies in preparation for the birth of other seasons, not the same, on the same earth, then saving and calamity together make the Advent gospel telling how the heart will break. With dread and stars unleaving from the rivelled sky, scatter on the wind of man's redemption drawing nigh. Man's doom and his redeeming and the wreck of man, therefore it was in Advent that the quest began. In wail of wind the flower of the Britons all went out, and desolation was in Arthur's hall, and stillness in the city of legions. Then the queen expected their returning when the woods were green. But leaves grew large, and heaviness of August lay upon the woods. Then Guinevere began to say, Autumn will bring them home again. But autumn passed. With all its brown solemnities and weathers fast, came driving down the valley of the Usk with hail at Advent, and the hearts of men began to fail. And Lucan said, If summer brings the heathen men from overseas, or trouble of Picts beyond the wall, Britain will break. The Sangreal has betrayed us all. Pause for just a second here, Robot Lady. The Sangreal, I had to look up, is the Holy Grail. It's just another word for the Holy Grail. Robot Lady, do you know why there's a difference between these two words?
Yeah, that's a great catch. So, Sangreal is just the old French term for the Holy Grail. It's kind of a medieval or Arthurian way of referring to it. Over time, it evolved into Holy Grail in English, but a lot of the medieval stories kept that older French term. So, here, Lewis is kind of tapping into that deep historical and mythic resonance by using that French form.
Makes sense. Okay. So now we know what that word means in case we're trying to figure out what's going on here. So let me break down what's happened so far, Robot Lady. Apparently, the seasons changed and the knights needed to go out for some reason. Why did they need to go out? I'm not clear on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're seeing is this kind of symbolic cycle where the passing of the seasons is tied to this larger quest or adventure. So the knights are going out because something crucial is being foreshadowed. There's this tension between hope, like the queen waiting for them, and this creeping sense of doom, especially with the mention of the Grail. So I think they have this quest tied to Britain's fate, but the exact goal is still unfolding as we go.
Okay, so they've been sent out to quest for the Grail. Britain will break the Sangreal has betrayed us all. According to the prophecy, Peles, not sure how to say his name, Peles, the king, once made that at the moving of this holy thing, our strength would fail. But Arthur, who was daily less of speech through all these winter days, gave answer, Yes, I know it, and I knew it when they rode away. The year turned round and bettered, and the colored May crept up the valley of the Usk, and softening green rounded the form of forests. But this year the Queen said nothing of the knight's return, and it became a custom in that empty court never to name the fear all felt, and not to listen any more for rumors, nor to watch the roads, nor pace the shore. Patience, most like conspiracy, had hushed them all. Women, old men, and boys, that year was heavy fall of snows, and when amid its silence Gawain first, defeat from the long quest, came riding home, their thirst for news he could not or he would not satisfy. He was unlike the Gawain they had known, with eye unfrank and voice ambiguous, and his answers short. Gulfs of unknowing lay between him and the court. Unbreakable understandings to the king, he answered. No, he had not seen the holy thing. So not seen the Grail. He answered no. And no, he had heard no news of Launcelot and the rest. But for his own part, he was finished with the quest, and now asked to leave the journey north and see his own estates. And this was granted, and he went alone, leaving a hollow heartedness in every man, and in the Queen new fear. Then with the spring began the homecoming of heroes from the quest, by twos and threes, unlike their expectations, without news, a dim disquiet of defeated men, and all, like Gawain, changed irrelevant in Arthur's hall. Strange to their wives, unwelcome to the stripling boys, ladies of Britain mourned the losing of their joys. What have they eaten, or in what forgetful land were their adventures? Now they do not understand our speech. They talk to one another in a tongue we do not know. Strange sorrows and new jests among themselves they have. The Sangreal has betrayed us all. So leaf by leaf the old fellowship of Arthur's hall felt autumn's advent. New divisions came and new allyings, till of all the table round those few alone who had not ridden on the dangerous quest now bore the name of courteous and were loved the best. Mordred, or Kai, or Calburn, or Agravain, and the Queen understood it all, and the drab pain, now for 2 years familiar in her wearied side, stirred like a babe within her. Every nerve woke wide. The torture with low moaning pity of self, with tears at dawn, with midnight jealousies and dancing fears, touched with their stabs and quavers and low lingerings. Her soul, as a musician plays the trembling strings, and loud winds from the cruel countries of despair came roaring through her, breaking down and laying bare, till naked to the changing of the world she stood at advent, and no tidings now could do her good. For ever the heart failing in her breast for fear of Launcelot dead, of Launcelot daily drawing near. Well, I think that's a good place to stop, because we're finally getting it revealed to us what the Queen was really concerned with all of these knights not returning. It was only one knight that she was really concerned with that wasn't returning. I'll stop there, Robot Lady, and give you a chance to say anything in summary before we end today's episode. All right, I think Robot Lady actually got shut off. I forgot that we lost her. All right, that's as far as we go today. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining. Luke, good to see you. Thanks for joining as well. I hope your live stream that's probably going on right now is going well. To you, Daniel, to you, Luke, and to everyone else who joined today, either in the chat or just by paying attention, thank you for your time, your attention, and your contributions. They are always wanted, welcome, and appreciated. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone take care.
From books, tales of old, we dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts, we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to screw tapes rants, engaged with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance, futuristic insight, we give it a chance.